Alaska is in kind of an unusual identity crisis right now because it's still, when John McPhee wrote about it, it was this it was still an American frontier, and that's the case today too. It's the size of the next three biggest U.S. states put together. And there are fewer than 1 million people living there, and only four interstate highways. So it's just wild. I mean, you can walk for, and I did walk for weeks, months at a time and not encounter anyone or any sign of other people. Um, and yet it's also the fastest warming corner of our planet. So it's sort of the frontier of humankind's geological footprint. And so it's a place where, when I showed up, people were talking about it. What's happening to this place? What's happening to the caribou, to the fish, to the forests? And there was kind of a small cadre of scientists who had both the scientific kind of toolbox and the outdoor skills to actually spend long periods of time in the wilderness trying to answer deep questions about how it's changing. And I didn't know when I first showed up in Alaska what exactly I was going to do, but it pretty quickly became clear that there was a big story, if not the story, of Alaska in this period in history was what are this small group of scientists, what are they seeing? So I started following these people around, and yeah, I'd spend long periods of time. I spent about 4 months cumulative walking and rafting about 1,000 miles across Arctic Alaska, a mountain range in Arctic Alaska, with an ecologist named Roman Dial. We'd hike. There's no trails up there. You walk and pack raft. Pack rafts are these little inflatable boats that you can pack them down to the size of a paper towel roll, and they weigh a few pounds. And you can bring these little paddles, and I mean you can take them down. They're pretty hardy. You can take them down uh, rapids. Roman Dial, who I was traveling with, is taking them down, class five rapids. Um, and then I spent part of a winter living with a permafrost scientist, a man named Kenji Yoshikawa, who lives off the grid. He studies how frozen Alaska's frozen ground, really the planet's frozen ground, is changing as the climate warms. So I spent several weeks living off the grid with him at his homestead where he raises reindeer. And I flew with a glaciologist named Matt Nolan, um, who is the only person studying the glaciers of Arctic Alaska, which are just scientifically fascinating but super remote. And he flies there and lands on the glaciers himself. He's been in a bunch of plane crashes, but he's just so passionate about this research. He keeps, taking on these risks and has produced really extraordinary data for the glaciology community as a result. So it was, the learning curve was incredibly steep for me, because I was not this grizzled, skilled outdoors person coming in. I just was interested. And that's really a lot of the book. One moment that comes to mind came from the first week of my first expedition with Roman Dial. We were in the Brooks Range, which is a mountain range the size of California, with one road kind of bisecting it. But otherwise, it's a wild place. And we were walking for about 6 weeks across it, across the eastern portion of it to understand how boreal forests are responding to climate change. And Rome and I shared a tent together for those 6 weeks, just the two of us. And one morning, he said it's going to rain all day. He sighed and said it's going to rain all day. And I said, "How do you know? You know, you haven't even been outside the tent." And he pointed to the tent, and there were a few raindrops that were hitting the tent, and he said, "It just has that sound." The sound of the raindrops told him that it was going to rain all day, and it did. And that was sort of a first clue that Roman was moving through a different world than I was. He was so perceptually attuned to that environment that it often felt like I was just in a little cave. I was hived off in my mind. I was lost in thought. So, in many ways, I was learning over the course of these expeditions how to pay attention to the world, to things that aren't fighting for your attention, to get out of your own head and try to see what's actually there. And I think that's a a kind of an attentional mode that doesn't get as much play in our current conversations about the attention economy. You know, obviously social media is making us, it's shortening our attention spans. It's making it harder to sit down and read a book. But it also, I think, outcompetes a lot of uh, non-human kinds of beings and stimulus and information that can be both important and also awe-inspiring. So I was learning to pay attention, and and the book is largely kind of recounting that attentional journey. It's really everywhere up there, and some of it's kind of subtle, you know, and you have to know, for example, what's a normal amount of fish to catch or a normal amount of caribou to see, or when it's no whether it's normal to be, you know, sweltering in your tent in the Arctic. I mean, you can't really say unless you've spent a lot of time there. But anyone who has will tell you this is not normal. And then there are things that are just kind of hit you over the head. So on my most recent expedition with Roman, for example, we came across these land formations called retrogressive thaw slumps, which are essentially just places where ground that used to be frozen has thawed, and then the entire landscape deforms and falls apart. So you'll be walking through a valley and all of a sudden you'll come to a place. It looks almost like a glacier, just you know, for miles and miles. The land is just slid, fallen. The mountains is basically collapsed, like a giant mudslide. And it looks like someone. My friend Russell said it looks like someone has taken a you know a piece of another planet and just thrown it you know onto the earth. Just rock and mud and this slurry of just raw earth has wiped out the entire valley. Um, those things feel very eerie, and it kind of does feel like, you know, the world's, I mean, the world, the landscape is literally falling apart. That's not normal. Um, and then there's the fires. You know, I got stuck for about a week at an airstrip because of some of the biggest forest fires in state history. I mean, yeah, fires have gotten a lot more common, a lot more destructive. Another piece that really, I think, really hurt was the river that John McPhee traveled down in coming into the country, which he described as the clearest, purest water he's ever seen or tasted. You know, he again and again in coming into the country, he describes this river and the clarity of the water and the fish he's catching there. Um, well, now Roman, who I've done all these trips with, Roman has discovered that that river, which is very near where I traveled very near there, is orange now because as these soils, as the Arctic begins to thaw, it sometimes leaches metals that oxidize into the water table and into creeks and rivers and makes them, uh, renders them no longer potable. It can kill the fish. And so the Salmon River that McPhee wrote about so movingly and that initially moved me to want to go to Alaska is orange. And actually, I came back from a trip in Alaska a few years ago to an envelope from John McPhee with this story about the Salmon River. And he said, he scrawled across the top of it, this came as a blow to the solar plexus. Um, so yeah, that hurts a lot. And but there's so many. I mean, I could talk about die-offs of seabirds, birds washing up